happy Wednesday to you all. My name is Kevin Burns. I'm the mayor of Geneva, Illinois, and chairman of the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus Environment Committee and Energy Subcommittee. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to the inaugural Energy Academy provided by the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. Our professor today is none other than Mark Pruitt, former director of the Illinois Power Authority. For those of you interested, how did Mark get into this field? Well, it began a long time ago when Mark was a biology teacher in high school, and it dawned on him that he found the power industry far more exciting than teaching kids biology because, and I quote, "I don't like other people's children." So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mark Pruitt.
It's been a voyage of personal discovery. Thank you. Oh, go ahead, Edith. I'm sorry.
No, you get to rebut a little bit, and I'm going to do some introductory comments. So you get to...
No rebuttal. It's all true. Guilty as charged.
And I'll just start. My name is Edith Macker. I'm the environment director for the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, and I get credit for finding Mark because as I started working in the energy space at the Mayor's Caucus, and I was completely lost and overwhelmed. Whenever I asked Mark a question, I found that I understood. I understood what he was saying, and that's when I discovered that he had been a former high school teacher, and so therefore I think he's in a terrific position to really work with our audience, which is municipal officials, and help us understand the complex world of energy. So we're very, very, very fortunate to have a longstanding relationship with Mark Pruitt. So thank you all for being here. Of course, we are delighted with the response. As Mayor Burns said, we had we capped it at 80, and I think we actually have 75 who responded, but still people are still trying to sneak in under the wire, and we're flattered with that. We designed the Energy Academy to help municipal officials navigate energy policies and programs and procurement with the goal of saving your constituents money, reducing energy burden, saving municipal operations money, and helping you move towards resilience and clean energy and sustainability goals. We are really grateful to the grant support that we received from the Illinois Science and Energy Innovation Fund, or ISEF, which is a grant program that has been supporting us. This is in our third year and final year. And actually the idea of having the Academy was as we lose this support, hopefully gain some others, but lose this support, we really take the opportunity to empower all of you as municipal officials to continue at working in energy policy more independently and to be able to respond to opportunities. We, as Mayor Burns said, we have a very strong response to this. We had initially, in our grant proposal to ISEF, had said we would try to train some 30 sustainability commissioners from municipalities, and we are really flattered with the response and the diversity of communities. And just a note about that, so we have expanded, basically, Mark has agreed to double the offering. So if you got a late night or a flurry of emails from Cheryl Scott, that was us scrambling to try to accommodate the strong demand for this while allowing the opportunity for some dialogue and discussion. And that's hard to do with 75 people in a Zoom call. So we are offering 2 duplicate sessions. We will continuing offering this on Wednesday at noontime as originally programmed. The course will continue for 7 sessions. We have chosen the alternating Thursdays, meaning starting next week, the same course will be offered and will continue for 7 weeks as well over the lunch hour. Content will be the same. We will record the session and make that available to you. As you know from registration, we are offering a certificate of participation for whatever you can use that for to decorate your walls or advance your career. Go for that. We'll do our best to keep track of everybody's attendance. Staff is small and the class is quite large, so please help us manage the dialogue by asking pertinent questions in the chat. And we will do our best to facilitate Mark answering those questions. And Mark is experienced at working with a large group, so we'll do our best to make sure that everybody has a chance to understand everything. And we'll have a little time for dialogue as well. We do not have time for introductions, but I wanted to share the information we got from the registration forms with all of you. We do have 74 participants in these 2 sessions. This includes 42 municipalities and 2 counties, as well as the R1 regional planning Council in Rockford joining us. 35 of these communities are already Greenest Region Compact communities, and a few of you have yet to adopt the GRC and join us in supporting these common goals, especially related to energy. We've already seen most of these communities, 33 of you, involved in some kind of MMC programs. 19 of our participants are elected officials, trustees, city council members, county board members, and mayors. So thank you all for being here. We have a lot of management staff as well, village managers and management staff. About a quarter of the staff are from public works, engineering, electric utility, economic development, community development, sustainability. Notably, we have 3 municipalities representing municipal electric utilities. 13 of our participants are also volunteer commissioners. So with that, I will let Mark, he's got additional introductions there, but just before I turn it over to him, Mark Pruitt is the principal with the Power Bureau. The Mayor's Caucus has had a relationship with Mark for many years as a consultant in developing some of our unique programs related to clean energy procurement, most recently our community solar project. So Mark knows the municipal world very well. He's also got clients throughout 60 municipalities that he's worked with on sustainability initiatives and municipal aggregation. So again, please use the chat for dialogue and questions. Mark has a presentation, and we look forward to learning quite a bit in this first session, and hopefully getting some of your thoughts and questions at the end. So over to you, Mark.
Great, thanks, Edith. I'm going to go ahead and share. If someone can give me a thumbs up and let me know that everything's displaying, I'll go ahead and get started.
We can see it.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for your time and commitment to showing up on your lunch hour. My name is Mark Pruitt. I'm the principal of the Power Bureau. Today, for this class, think of this as kind of an overview. Just in looking at the attendees and their experience, everybody is really coming into this at a different level of knowledge in different areas of the energy sector. So today is really meant to baseline some key issues that we'll be revisiting through the process. So if some of this is already very familiar to you, great. If some of this is new, that's fine. That's why we're going to cover it. And if there's questions at the end, we're going to leave 10, 15 minutes at the end for questions. So, pop your questions into chat. Those will be moderated by Edith and Cheryl, and then we'll be able to work through those. There's quite a bit of material to cover. So this is going to be a little bit of high speed, low drag to get through it all and leave time for questions, but we will get through everything. So again, thank you very much. The agenda for today is an overview, and then we're going to talk about energy sources and uses in the United States for energy and CO2 emissions. Then we're going to talk about the grid, just kind of baseline how all this system works and fits together. We'll then talk about energy and emissions patterns, both nationally and in Illinois, and then we'll have things left open for discussion. So in the overview, you already had all the pertinent information about my background. Yes, I did go to school to become a high school teacher, and it didn't work out. But I've tried to keep myself busy. Right now, I serve as principal of the Power Bureau and Illinois Community Choice Aggregation Network, which is a community choice aggregation consulting firm. In the past, I served as the director of a state agency that negotiates wholesale power for ComEd and Ameren customers, as well as manages the state's renewable portfolio standard. I've also worked at University of Illinois and at NICOR. I teach currently at Northwestern University and University of Illinois in their master's programs. I teach energy policy, and I'm working at Argonne National Lab on an energy transition planning exercise for the country of Indonesia. My contact information is on the left. If you ever felt the need to reach me directly, please feel free. That's why it's out there. I also wanted to recognize those that have signed up for the program. I'm not going to read everybody's names, but as of last night when I put this together, there were 44 communities represented by 74 individuals. So again, thank you. A great representation here. You may have already received this, the weekly classes and topics. I'm not going to read these things to you, This is going to be recorded, and again, if you want this layout, you can request the presentation. But we're going to start with the background today, the energy sector background. Then we're going to move to how the energy markets works. How do we know 10 cents a kilowatt hour is the right price? Right. We'll dig into how prices are made in the wholesale market. Then we'll talk about utilities, how they operate, why they operate the way they do, what are their constraints, and what are their objectives, what are their drivers. Then we'll be looking at energy policy, and we'll really dig into the legal structure here in Illinois and then nationally, and how they incentivize and disincentivize certain types of activities in the energy sector. We'll talk about goals and constraints for the local, specifically for local governments towards decarbonization, electrification, some of those issues that are really coming to the fore in the sustainability sector. We'll then talk about specifically renewable energy and how the deployment of renewable energy can be accelerated at the local level, and then energy efficiency. And in both those final weeks, we'll be talking very specifically about Illinois and ComEd, and how municipalities can optimize for the tools that are out there right now. Additionally, as part of the proposal, there's an additional 10 hours of optional engagement. Won't be classroom type stuff. This will be kind of working on practical problems. So it's up to you how we spend the 10 hours together. But these are some areas that I thought you might be interested in based on your responses when you enrolled in the program. So we can really dig in and maybe move beyond talking theory and get down to is the roadmap for increasing renewable energy purchasing at the municipal level, or promoting local solar development, or anything else that isn't on this list that is of high interest to you. So this is the follow-on, and we'll be talking about how to utilize that as we go through the course. So happy to take your recommendations and suggestions as we go forward. So let's get into the materials here. I always like to start with the big picture, right? And the big picture that's before you right now is, what is it that the United States does with regard to energy, right? What energy is used within our economy, and how has that changed over time? And what's the relative scale? Because it's hard to get that sense of how big is big, right? So in this case, don't worry about how big is big in terms of total, quadrillion British thermal units, which is how things are measured in this particular graph. Think about the relative scale of petroleum versus natural gas versus coal versus renewables, nuclear, hydro, wood, etc. And this is economy-wide. So this is for energy used for transportation, manufacturing, generating electricity, etc. And look at the trend, right? At one point in time, coal, wood was the dominant fuel type, going back a long, long time ago into the 1800s. Then coal came to really drive the energy story in the United States through the early 1900s. And then after coal comes the growth of petroleum, and then the growth of natural gas. And this is how things work, right, in economies. We continually gravitate to more plentiful or more efficient fuel sources. So this is where we're at right now. And I know that there's a high level of interest in renewables. And I always try to remind our friends in the renewable sector that when they say, look, solar increased 20% last year over year, that's great, but renewables are still a very small part of the total energy picture. So there's a long ways for them to go. And I don't bring this up to be discouraging, it's more to provide perspective. When we look at specifically into the electricity sector and where the energy, the sources of electricity generation, same type of story. So we're talking about petroleum, fossil gas, coal. We're seeing that same story play out here, where coal is dropping. Fossil gas, also known as natural gas, is growing. We see that nuclear has kind of plateaued. We see pretty good growth in wind, growth in solar. We see standard kind of level state for other renewables and hydro. But, again, in the totality of the electricity generation market, the renewables are still a pretty small portion of the story. Doesn't mean that can't change. It just means that they're not the predominant fuel source at this time. This is a little bit more of a complex graphic, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. You can come back and seek this out. Also, you can go to the source and pull down through the link at the bottom of the slide, and it'll take you to the source of this slide. And basically, all this says is on the left-hand side, these are all the sources of energy throughout the entire United States economy in 2021. Then the bars show how that energy source is then distributed. If you take a look at natural gas in the middle, it's the light blue. A certain portion of the natural gas energy in the United States went to, towards the top of the page, towards electricity generation. Some of it was divided out to residential, commercial, and industrial sectors, a little bit to transportation for fueling of heating and transportation. But this is just a way of saying, okay, at the end of the day, what is the U.S. energy sector using, and where is it going? Into the residential, commercial, industrial, transportation fields, the pink boxes. What might be of interest to you is the rejected energy box in the kind of the northeast corner. That's all just energy loss through inefficiencies of use or conversion of fuel to electricity. So there's a substantial amount of waste in the system, and that's something that might be of interest from a policy perspective for the local governments. This is just a similar graph that is just showing the sources of carbon dioxide emissions in 2021, and again, natural gas, coal, and petroleum are the primary drivers here. So that's just a level set in terms of, where are we at nationally with energy and uses. So let's talk a little bit about the electricity grid, because I think ultimately a lot of our focus is going to be on the grid. So when we talk about the grid, we're actually talking about three primary sectors, and they're represented on this graphic. So it's generation in red, transmission in blue, and distribution in green. These are the three stages of electricity production and delivery. And in the aggregate, these comprise the grid. Now, you can call the local distribution system from ComEd the local grid, or for your municipal utility, that can be a grid as well. But for most of what I'm going to be talking about in this course, when we say the grid, we're talking about the totality of the system: generation, transmission, and substations. And as you'll see in the next few slides, this is actually a fairly complex system, but just at the macro level, these three sectors are what we're talking about when we say, use the term grid. So first is generation. Generation is basically power plants or power generating assets. And you have here a graphic from the Energy Information Administration. Again, the link is at the bottom if you wanted to go capture this or customize this map. And all I've done here is I have the map populated with data showing natural gas power plants in blue, coal power plants in black, petroleum plants in brown, and nuclear power plants in purple, right? These are kind of the traditional power assets. They're typically located relatively close to population centers, right? That's just how it's always been. This shows what would be, the renewable sector with solar assets in yellow, wind assets in gray, hydroelectric resources in blue, biomass in green, and then geothermal in magenta. And those geothermal assets are out in the Rockies, if you look to the left of the map. And this isn't to quiz you on anything, it's just to give you a sense of where these assets are. Typically, these assets, the renewable assets, tend to be close to where that asset or where that fuel is. Geothermal, solar, wind, hydro, right? You need a river for hydroelectricity. With the caveat that incentives can move some renewables, namely solar, into areas that are not necessarily high solar generating potential areas. And there can also be disincentives that can prevent the deployment of some of these resources. If you look in, say, the Gulf states, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, you can see a relative dearth of solar down there, where we know it's sunny and could be maybe a good proposition. Well, those represent regulatory constraints. But in any case, the renewable resources need to have some type of support. It's either proximity to a really good renewable energy source, or it needs to have an incentive that makes the economics for that resource work. When we talk about generation, we're talking about two things. The first thing is generating capacity. That's the maximum generating potential from a power asset, right? If you have a 5 kW rooftop solar system on your roof, that means at the maximum output, it could generate 5 kW. Most of the time, it doesn't generate 5 kW, but the maximum is 5 kW. This pie chart just shows in the United States, where is the maximum generation potential? Well, it's 43% of the maximum generating potential of 1.14 million megawatts comes from natural gas. Natural gas is a major portion of what can meet our maximum load, right? The hottest day in summer. Coal is also a large part of that. Renewables are fairly high potential for maximum output. Nuclear is actually pretty small, and then petroleum. So that's capacity. That's the maximum output. Let's take a look at what the actual output was in 2021. Actual generation reflects how much useful energy actually was delivered to the grid. And as you see, it's a little bit different story. With special regard to renewables, renewables represent 37% of maximum capacity in the United States. That's the top pie chart. The bottom pie chart shows that only 20% of annual generation came from renewables. Well, I think we all know intuitively what's happening here. You can have a wind farm, you can have a solar farm, but the sun might not be showing, right? Or the wind might not be blowing. So while you might have a 100 kW wind farm, a 100 megawatt wind farm in the middle of Illinois, if the wind's not blowing, you have 100 megawatts of capacity that's not generating anything, right? So that's why we call those resources intermittent, meaning that their output goes up and down with the availability of their fuel. So this whole question about availability comes to a term called capacity factor. Capacity factor is a term you may hear later in the course, so we'll just hit on it right now. We'll revisit it later. But capacity factor is just a measure of how often the power asset is operating at its maximum power. That's it. It's a question of utilization. So for capacity factor, you see that, say, the nuclear power assets in the United States, they're at maximum output 93% of the time. Highly reliable resources, right? If you take a look at renewables, they're at 29.9%. Again, they're intermittent. You see natural gas at 36%. That's because natural gas can turn on and off and cycle up and down fairly easily, right? It's a balancing fuel. So no one of these is better than the others. It's just that they're different and they have different characteristics. And part of what we're going to discuss in this course is how they fit together to ensure reliability and cost effectiveness, right? Second stage of the grid is transmission system. So when we say transmission, what we're talking about are those wires that run along the highway that are really big and have really tall towers, right? Those are transmission lines. They're usually between 138 and 765 kilovolts in size, and they span all the way across the United States. Their purpose is to connect the power plants to local utility systems. That's what they're doing. They're moving power over large distances. That's why they're so big. Their purpose is to provide reliability through redundancy, right? So you have multiple power plants connected to large population centers like Northern Illinois, and provide some variety of resources so that the lowest cost resources can be utilized, right? That's what the transmission system does for us. If we didn't have transmission, we'd have to have that power plant right in the middle of our neighborhood. So to kind of get you into thinking about how the transmission system works, it's like a network. You have here a map of the transmission system in northern Illinois. And those are the red lines and the orange lines. And you see that they are different voltages. You see that sometimes they go off into nowhere. Sometimes you see that multiple lines come together. You might even take a look down here towards the bottom of the map and see in Peoria, there's a power plant called Powerton, which is all the way in downstate, that's connected by this orange high voltage line all the way up into the Chicagoland area, right? But think about this as a network, right? Chicago is not completely reliant on one power plant. All these power plants put energy into the transmission system, and that transmission system is redundant with the power flowing to where it needs to go, but it has multiple power plants connected to it. So when we talk about transmission, just think about this as a network, right? These networks fit together and within regions, and they allow power to kind of flow fairly freely over large regions. And those large regions are called interconnections in the United States. And there are some power flows between these interconnections, but not very much. Usually when we're talking power in the Eastern interconnection, we're talking about power that's generated and consumed largely within that green area on the map. You see that Texas kind of does its own thing down in the Texas interconnection, sometimes also called ERCOT. You have a Western connection, etc. So if you hear the term interconnection, what you're talking about is a system of transmission lines that interconnect and provide the free flow of electricity over a large region. The Western connection, in case you're asking, you wanted to ask, is separated from the Eastern connection largely along the lines of where the Rocky Mountains are, right? It's just too expensive to span transmission lines over the Rocky Mountains. So that's why there are these different interconnections. So let's drop down to the third leg of the grid, which is the distribution system. So distribution system is your local utility, your local municipal electric company, your local cooperative, Commonwealth Edison, Ameren, Illinois. Those are all local delivery companies. Their job and their function is to take high voltage electricity from the transmission system and then reduce its voltage or step it down to a voltage that can be used in your home and business or factory. So on this graph, this diagram here, look to the upper right-hand corner in the blue circle. There's a substation. The substation is where high voltage transmission supply comes in, and what comes out is a lower level of voltage of electricity. That lower voltage electricity then goes out into the community, and it is connected to transformers in the red circles. Those transformers further step down the voltage for the needs of the consumers that are connected to that transformer, okay? Some consumers need three-phase service, others need single-phase service. In, say, a city or a densely populated area or near a large factory or industrial sites, you're probably going to see three-phase transformers. In a more rural environment that's primarily agricultural, residential, you probably see single phase. But in any case, this system has been around for over 100 years. And the traditional theory of the system, the way it was designed, was that high voltage comes in, it steps down in terms of voltage, and it flows out to the consumers. And it's primarily a one-way system, right? From high voltage down to the consumer. Well, things are changing. And you've probably heard talk about smart grid later, but smart grid is a new system design concept. And it takes into account that consumers now have the option to have on-site batteries or rooftop solar. There's technologies that can reduce consumption within the household or the building to facilitate demand response. So there's a lot of technological solutions that are here today that weren't around 50 and 60 years ago. So the system needs to be updated to allow these technologies to deliver their benefits to consumers. And that's why you see a lot of investment from all the distribution utilities giving way to more sensors, more monitoring, allowing for two-way electricity flow from the system to the consumer and then from the consumer to the system. And the theory is that this will allow for more distributed generation, more energy storage, more demand response, electric vehicles, etc. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but just so you understood where all these pieces fit together, that is the grid when we reference the grid in the subsequent classes. So let's talk about energy emissions and patterns. We saw the big graph earlier, but let's drill down in a little bit more detail here. So for the US, electricity generation in the US has been fairly flat for the past 12 years. I mean, even going back to, right after the 2008 recession, we've recovered from that, but we haven't seen the consistent rise that we saw in electricity generation that we saw prior to the 2008 downturn. So that tells us that we're in some kind of a stasis environment where demand isn't growing to a level where new generation or additional generation needs to be provided to the consumer sector. In this data that's from Statista, we see that not only as total generation plateaued, but nuclear generation is plateaued. We see, as we knew, that coal has declined. That's the brown segment of the columns. You see that getting more narrow off to the right. And natural gas has largely increased. We do see some modest gains in the renewable sector. In terms of emissions on a detailed basis, the sources of those emissions are pretty consistent over time, with the exception of what we've seen in the transportation sector and electricity generation. Now, there was a drop off in a lot of things in 2020, so we expect that subsequent analysis will show some recovery. But in the end, in the available data, we're seeing that electric generation sector is where we've seen most of the reductions in the sources of CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. When we talk about the specifics of the greenhouse gas emissions, overall levels of CO2 have reduced, and again, that's largely tied to the changes in the U.S. electric generation sector, primarily the retirement of coal plants. Relatively flat for all the other greenhouse gases. Turning to Illinois, excuse me, we pulled the data that in the bars, the columns on the chart. You see the relative generation from the different sources of electricity or fuels in Illinois. So coal, again, you see a pretty dramatic reduction over the last 11 years in the graph. You see natural gas growing. You see that nuclear stayed pretty stable, and then a little bit of growth in wind and a little bit of solar. What you see here on the line is the consumption. And this is something that's unique to Illinois, and from a policy standpoint, it's something that we'll need to think about over time, is that for years, Illinois has generated more electricity than it's used. That means that Illinois is an energy exporter. And the flow of electricity has been primarily from northern Illinois out to the east, predominantly to Ohio and Pennsylvania. As more plants are retired in Illinois, that could change, where electricity might actually flow more consistently from east to west into Illinois. And that's something that our grid operators, PJM and MISO, are examining now. But it's an issue for down the road, but it is an issue nonetheless. You build a system today, and then life happens, things change. So we're going to talk about what's changed and what are the implications of a change from being converting from an energy exporter to being an energy importer. So how's Illinois doing on emissions? Well, CO2 emissions, according to US DOE, have really dropped off and have been consistent. The transportation sector now, according to DOE and Illinois EPA, is the largest CO2 emitting sector today, not the power sector in Illinois. Pretty interesting. When we take a look at the power sector in Illinois and we look at the emissions that are attributable to coal plants in black, petroleum used in power plants in blue, and then natural gas used in power plants in orange, we see that, you know, over time, emissions dropped in the early 90s and then increased over time, and now we're in a decrease cycle. What will be interesting is based on the projections that I've made that reflect the reduction in emissions from power plant announcements that run through 2025, is that Illinois is going to be able to meet its U.S. Climate Alliance goals, which sought to have a 26 to 28% reduction in power sector emissions between 2005 levels by 2025. I'm sorry, it's economy-wide emissions are to be reduced by 26 to 28%. The power sector is going to realize just under a 37% reduction just on its own. So it looks like, based on the strength of the power sector, Illinois is going to be able to meet those U.S. Climate Alliance goals. Sorry, I misspoke earlier. So now we're open for discussion, and I'm going to take this off share so that we can see each other, and we'll take a look at what's shown up in the chat. Edith, Cheryl, you know, happy to you know, open it up for discussion or questions.
We don't have any questions in the chat. So if you do have a question, please go ahead and type something. Might give you a minute to type something. And if that doesn't work, we'll go to hand raising. Question from Marcelo. How does rooftop photovoltaic or PV interact with the grid in this area?
It's a good question, and it actually interacts in a couple of different ways. When that electricity is generated and consumed at the household level, it takes pressure off the local grid, because now the 5 kW that was being drawn from the grid to support that household is now not required. So the grid can, the local distribution company might not have to upgrade the substation to increase service levels. It might mean less strain on the grid, so maybe less maintenance is necessary. It also can allow for some circumstances when the solar generates more electricity than the household is using. So that's actually pushing electricity back out into the distribution grid. And that, again, alleviates a certain amount of pressure on the local distribution system. It can complicate things, right? If you get too much on-site generation or behind the meter generation flowing back out into the local grid, now you have to be concerned with overloading the local substation. So there are some complications here, both good and bad, right? Or I'm sorry, I don't want to say good and bad, both manageable and less manageable issues. But this is why we have the local distribution company there to ensure safety, security. They establish the standards for on-site generation. And I think that as this becomes more prevalent, and with the deployment of battery technology, I think we're going to find that the local distribution companies are going to find ways to make this even more positive, not just for the consumer, but also for harnessing some value for the grid.
Mark, the next question, I'm going to combine two of them. So I think we're all fascinated with the rejected energy concept. And we have a question from Tessa in Northbrook to elaborate on the two reasons for rejected energy. And then kind of a pile-on question from Alex in Mount Prospect is, how can we reduce how can the grid reduce rejected energy and that loss or waste? So
sure. So the primary cause of rejected energy is heat loss. So just like when you or I burn gasoline in my engine, that motor operates, and some of the motor output is the mechanical energy, right? It moves my wheels and provides electricity for my radio, right? But a lot of that energy that's released is released in the form of heat, and that's why your engine gets hot. over time. That means that some of the gasoline that I put in becomes mechanical energy, useful energy, and some of it is wasted energy, that heat that I can't use. Same thing in a power plant. If you're burning coal, if you are burning natural gas, biomass even has the same problem, and even nuclear stations, they have a certain amount of wasted heat that just can't be converted into electricity. So that's where that rejected energy comes from. If you look at some of the statistics, for every BTU of energy in the form of fuel going into a power plant, you might only get out 0.3 MMBTU of electricity, depending on the technology, the age of the plant, and how that plant is being used. So that's where a lot of that rejected energy is coming from. The way you get around that is by gravitating towards more efficient generating assets. So as your 50 and 80-year-old coal plants go offline, they'll be replaced with other resources. They might be more efficient fossil resources, or they might be, solar and wind, which don't have the same problems because they're not combusting, right? So it's an issue that becomes solved as the portfolio of generation moves towards different types of generating resources.
Mark, next question from Laura Dirks is, can you explain high voltage to low voltage? I'm assuming that's the step down in transmission.
Right. So a transmission line might have 345 kV service, kilovolts of service. And if you were to connect that to your house, everything would just be overloaded with electricity and not work and probably cause a fire, right? So what you really need is to step that down from the 345 down to something that your refrigerator can handle, right? So 120, 240 service, right? So high voltage is what goes on the transmission lines. Lower voltage is what's delivered to your house. And it's the substation and the transformers. Those are the mechanical pieces of mechanical equipment that affect that step down capability.
Mark, and a question from Daryl in Oak Park was the question I wanted to ask when we saw on that map that Texas was doing its own thing.
Mhm.
And I'm suspecting this might be something that we'll cover later, but can you put what happened in Texas in last year in February in context as it relates to the resiliency that we have here in Illinois?
Sure. So Texas is kind of its own energy island. It's got some interconnection with the surrounding regions, but it is intentionally a transmission system that does not span over state lines. And that is intentional, as I mentioned. And the purpose and the intention there is that once the transmission lines cross over state lines, then jurisdictional authority of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission comes into play. And Texas didn't want FERC orders to be applicable to them. So they kept their transmission lines within their state borders. In terms of what happened last year, pretty much what happened in 2011 when they had a blackout in Texas for the same reasons. They had cold weather, which spiked demand. They had cold weather that froze out a substantial number of natural gas wells, and natural gas was not allowed to flow to the natural gas power plants that are within the region. So they started to have power plants shut down. The system operator called ERCOT was not able to maintain frequency on the system. Frequency is the reliability of the system in its steady state. When frequency couldn't be maintained, ERCOT was, by their own rules, required to impose rolling blackouts to ensure maintain the integrity of the system. Had they not imposed rolling blackouts, which are supposedly temporary and short-term blackouts to different portions of the system until the system stabilizes, had they not done that, the entire ERCOT transmission system could have been blacked out. The entire system could have been blacked out could have been month, 2 months, 3 months. So it was essentially a question of spiking demand and rapidly dropping supply that caused the problems in Texas. Do we have that issue here? I don't think so. However, on Christmas Eve, all of us in Northern Illinois came very close, probably within an hour, 2 hours of PJM, our grid operator, having to impose some rolling blackouts to maintain reliability in the PJM system. That's because about a quarter of the natural gas power plants in the PJM wholesale market weren't operating. Those non-operating assets are being fined about $2 billion, according to a news story I saw yesterday. So this is a real issue for everybody, not just those guys in Texas.
There's some good questions coming in here, and I'm tempted to go to the next Texas question.
Sure.
But in the interest of, okay, so a quick Texas question from Laura Dirks. There was a huge wind farm near Padre Island that is privately owned and doesn't power nearby electricity needs. Is that true? And I mean, could a wind farm be privately owned, and how is the energy transmitted to non-local places?
Well, in my experience, most wind farms are privately owned. That's the, I've known of a few that have been owned by utility companies, but most of them are owned by what are termed in the industry independent power producers. As such, they connect to the transmission system and simply sell their electricity into the transmission system. So they're not typically set up to generate electricity for a specific user, unless it's, say, a wind turbine at a school, right? But if you're talking about a large wind farm, those wind farms generate electricity that connect to the transmission system, and then that electricity goes into the general marketplace. So the electrons are never specific. The electrons travel path of least resistance based on physics, and they're released into the transmission system. I don't know if that's responsive to where you wanted to go with the question, Laura, but that's my experience.
Mark, moving along, I'm going to go back to the natural gas question. And there are two, so I'm going to read them together. One from Kyra in Chicago. The two questions are related. How much is the increase in natural gas usage due to compensating for the retirement of coal in the state and across the country versus a general increase in power needs? And the related question from Marcella in Oak Park is related to the recent growth in natural gas use. And is that trend likely to continue? And how do projected electricity and natural gas fuel prices influence this future trend? So if you want to address that spike we all saw in natural gas.
Good questions. In my estimation, and there are those who disagree, I think almost all of the natural gas consumption increase is directly related to replacement of electricity generation retirements of coal generating plants. So I think there's a high correlation there that I don't think is coincidence. So it's mostly replacement. You're moving from coal to natural gas to generate about the same amount of electricity. In terms of where I think that goes or what the implications are, the challenge with any, from a cost standpoint, it might be one way to look at response to Marcella's question. When you start to be overly reliant on a single fuel source or highly reliant on a single fuel source, that means you're exposed to that fuel source's cost elements. So natural gas is a pretty volatile commodity, right? If a hurricane blows in, prices go up. You got a war in Kiev, prices go up. You start exporting more natural gas from North America, well, all of a sudden, you're not paying traditional North American natural gas prices. You're competing against the Japanese and Europe, who are comfortable paying 2 and 3 times the US price for natural gas. As those price changes feed into the natural gas side, they will flow into the electricity sector, not only from a general price level, but also from a volatility level. So those are some primary implications that I would foresee of having greater reliance on natural gas. And there are other implications, but those are the most immediate.
Mark, this is Kevin Burns. There's a quick question in the chat regarding biofuels. Are those, quote, carbon neutral?
Biofuels?
the question is specifically on biomass.
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 Excuse me, yes.
So biomass, is it carbon neutral? I think there's some debate there. Traditionally, over the past 20 years, things go through cycles in this industry. So, biomass was a hot issue when I first got in the early 1990s, and now it's back, right? So traditionally, it's been viewed as being carbon neutral, but there have been a number of groups that have said, no, it's combustion and it's net additive. And, it was sequestered, but now it's not, right? You've released that CO2 as opposed to it going elsewhere. I don't have a firm and hard opinion on it, but I would say that, whatever the determination is from a policy perspective for biomass probably travels over to biofuels as well. So things like ethanol or other types of fuels that could go into the transportation sector. You might just want to be mindful that the policy for one is probably going to look similar to the policy for the other.
Mark and I have to pick.
Edith, I have another, I think,
Oh.
fairly straightforward question that we've discussed before in different environment committee meetings.
Mhm.
Is every ton of emission the same with respect to harm of the environment? Or does CO2 differ from methane? Methane differ from what have you?
Right. There are kind of a growing body of understanding in the industry that certain greenhouse gases are more potent, is the way I keep it straight in my head, than others. So methane being more potent than a standard CO2, an equal volume of CO2. So I think that where the industry is gravitating towards is counting CO2 equivalents. So if you see CO2 small e, that means the equivalent CO2. So that means that they've factored the methane to multiplied its small volume times a variable to get it to a higher volume to put it on par with the CO2. So that's one way to normalize the accounting for the difference between the various greenhouse gases. There are some other outputs from combustion that might come into play as well that aren't necessarily greenhouse gases. So that could be mercury, particulates, some other types of outputs that that don't necessarily have that same way of levelizing the value. But at least for the greenhouse gases, there's a way to get to an equivalence.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mark, there are a lot of questions. I think the one that I'm going to go to, just in the interest of time, is from Francisca French, because I think we hear this question a lot. With the increase in electric vehicles and some major manufacturers announcing they will convert to 100% EV production by 2035, are the nation's grid systems, particularly Illinois, prepared to handle the increase in demand?
No.
Okay, that was quick. Thank you. Move on then. Or is there more you want to say about that one?
We told you, everybody, that Mr. Pruitt's easy to understand. So
love it. Okay.
Extra no.
I'm going to indulge Mark Berger's energy geek question because he's piping up in the chat there. And that was, if you would, this is you two energy geeks can talk, but maybe educate everyone else. Compare capacity factor with runtime percentage as it pertains to renewable energy.
I'm not familiar with runtime percentage, so I really can't comment. I'm sorry.
Get a lollipop for stumping Mark. Mark. So there you go. We don't know that one. Another question, I guess, on. How about climate resilience? And this one again comes from Marcella. Looking at what happens in California with power disruptions due to wildfires, is it possible something like that could happen in Illinois due to drought and/or extreme heat events?
In Illinois, I'd say your real weakness in the system is would be in a drought. And that's not for wildfire considerations. It's more about power plant cooling. nuclear power plants, coal, natural gas plants do require a substantial amount of water to pass through their systems for the production of steam. So we could see circumstances where if retaining lakes or the rivers that serve as those cooling sinks for those primary generators in Illinois, if they were to fall below a certain level and could not be accessed by those power plants, those power plants would have to cycle back or shut off. That did happen in Germany this year with a drought that caused the Rhine River to drop to the historic low.
Okay, we are not going to get to all of them, but there are some really good questions too. So hopefully we'll cover more in future sessions. Is waste heat from generation meaning coal, gas, and geothermal fuels a significant factor of concern?
Well, that's that kind of wasted energy that was in one of the first graphs. If it could be captured and then circulated into, say, a ranking cycle process to capture a little bit more electricity out of it, it could work. If that electricity or that waste heat could be captured and used to be distributed to the local area in terms of space heating or water heating, that could be good as well. But it's an area of concern because it's a question of energy balance. You're putting a lot of energy in and you're not getting a lot of useful energy out. So if you could increase the efficiency, then you're using less fuel for the same amount of electrical output.
And I'm going to turn it back over to Kevin if he wants to close it down. But or one reminder that I just wanted to point out, and this is in response to the question about geothermal. Cheryl put in the chat that this will be a topic of our Environment Committee meeting in March, where we'll be having experts from the geothermal industry specifically addressing that. So thank you to those of you who are joining the Energy Academy and are not currently part of our Environment Committee. If you would respond to Cheryl Scott's emails, and if you are not currently on that distribution list, please indicate your interest. We just want to make sure you connect with your municipal leadership when you join, and we're happy to have you be a part of those conversations. So with that, we're at 1 o'clock. Kevin, do you want to?
No, perfect. I've always wanted to say class dismissed. Now I have the pleasure of doing so. Mark, thank you very, very much. And to all of you who participated, thank you. Remember, this is a recurring class, and we appreciate your investment of time, and we are confident that you leave this meeting perhaps better educated and maybe even better and more inspired to learn even more as we continue on with this course. So, Mark, thank you again.
Great. Thank you all.
Okay, we will see you on Wednesday. February 1st is the next class. And if you wish to switch to Thursdays, you will want to alternate. Next Thursday, the 26th, will be a repeat of this session. And you're certainly welcome to join that as well.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.